After the Trump administration took office, Keith Kellogg was appointed as the new Secretary of Defense. Recently, he has set the military keynote towards China. First of all, he continues to play up the so-called Chinese military threat, claiming that China's military strength is formidable. Then he emphasized that the Trump administration is reluctant to go to war with China. At the same time, Kellogg said that the Trump administration does not seek conflict with China and also does not believe that conflict is inevitable. What exactly does the U.S. Secretary of Defense mean by openly saying this to the global media? Is it shouting at China from afar? This is not shouting at China from afar. In fact, what the U.S. Secretary of Defense is saying is for the American people to hear, clearly demonstrating the Trump administration's military attitude towards China, which is never to go to war and to eliminate all ambiguity to avoid being secretly manipulated by his subordinates. Kellogg is a close confidant of Trump, but he has no foundation in the U.S. military. There is not a single person loyal to Kellogg throughout the entire U.S. military. He is a completely parachuted-in leader, and his highest military rank in history was only that of a platoon leader. Such a person is supposed to follow Trump's instructions to audit the U.S. military's accounts, carry out a major anti-corruption campaign in the U.S. military, and conduct a large-scale layoff at the Pentagon. Undoubtedly, there will be strong forces within the U.S. military opposing this, and they will never let Kellogg smoothly get these things done. The U.S. military personnel, such as Pompeo and Young, may not be afraid of Trump, but one situation must be guarded against, that is, the U.S. military using an excuse to drag the United States into a war, especially a medium to low-intensity war with potentially huge threats. Once the United States is trapped in a protracted war, not only will it be impossible to cut the U.S. military budget, but it may even have to significantly increase it. As long as the U.S. military, while following the orders of the Ministry of Defense to go out and provoke, accidentally oversteps a bit, it can then legitimately drag the United States into a conflict and shift the blame onto Trump. No country in the world meets this condition. Even Russia does not qualify because American public opinion is against going to war with Russia. Even if there are conflicts, the U.S. Department of State can come out to smooth things over and everything can be negotiated. The only country that meets this demand is China. Due to years of anti-China propaganda, American public opinion is not very friendly towards China. Public opinion indeed does not advocate going to war with China, but if the front line has been dragged into a war and losses have been incurred, this public opinion will not support retreating or impeaching the government. This fully meets the current needs of the U.S. military, a medium to low-intensity war but with potentially huge threats. Under normal circumstances, the U.S. military is reluctant to do so because under normal circumstances, it is the U.S. military that bleeds while politicians gain benefits. But if you touch the U.S. military's money bag, it's a different story. In a capitalist system, money is more important than life, even more important than the lives of senior U.S. military officers, let alone the grassroots. But this does not conform to Trump's interests, so Trump must resolutely prevent this from happening. That is, as soon as he took office, he emphasized to the global media that he is unwilling to go to war with China and does not seek conflict with China. Speaking to the media is speaking to the American people because the media connects with the common people. There is no need to speak to leaders of other countries through the media. Although it is against the anti-China public opinion environment in the United States to publicly state that the United States will never go to war with China, at least the red line has been clearly drawn. If the U.S. military in the Asia-Pacific region accidentally has a conflict with the Chinese military, the blame will not fall on the Trump administration. Trump also has a way to immediately impeach those responsible and defuse the situation. This must be stated in advance and emphasized repeatedly to the global media. Otherwise, if something really happens on the front line and then you try to explain it, you will be in a very passive position. In peacetime, it is extremely difficult for Chinese soldiers to cultivate craftsmanship. But if the opponent fires first and China still wins, it will be much easier to become a general. Trump's team knows this and will not allow such a thing to happen. Therefore, they made it clear in advance to leave no room for underhanded operations by their subordinates. The core task given by Trump to this new U.S. Secretary of Defense is to cut the U.S. military budget by 8% every year for 5 consecutive years. As long as this key performance indicator (KPI) is achieved, the Secretary of Defense doesn't need to worry about other matters. Although this Secretary of Defense only has the rank of a platoon leader, he was a platoon leader during the Afghanistan War. Kellogg spent most of his military service on the front line and understands well what kind of battles the frontline U.S. soldiers face. As for overall war arrangements and simulations, Kellogg may not be very knowledgeable, but the Pentagon does. Kellogg said that in the past decade or so, all the war simulations of China by the Pentagon have failed without exception, with a perfect record of failure. Kellogg never blindly believes in values and highly respects hard power. When he spoke at a NATO meeting, he clearly stated that we can discuss values at length. Values are important, but you can't shoot with values, and you can't. The text seems incomplete here. Shooting with flags is not an option, nor can one shoot with powerful speeches. Hard power is irreplaceable. Therefore, Hagases, this name might be a special term, or a wrong spelling here, and it's hard to translate accurately without more context. Here we just keep the original form for reference. Strongly opposes going to war with China. Meanwhile, Vice President Vance of the Trump administration was a combat journalist in the Iraq War, not a war correspondent, but a combat journalist who directly went to the front line with soldiers. This person's remarks are even more outrageous than Hagases. He publicly stated that Russia is invincible and Trump is facing reality. In order to prevent the United States from going to war, Vance even said that Russia is invincible. So what's wrong with Hagases saying that he is reluctant to go to war with China? He didn't say that China is invincible, which is already very diplomatic. Moreover, they know very well what the situation is like within the U.S. military. In terms of ideology, the real backbone of the U.S. military is extremely disappointed in the U.S. government. Those who stay in the U.S. military to draw salaries and do their jobs are a group of people overly meticulous in paperwork. In terms of hard power, China's hard power is well known around the world and can no longer be understated. Even with the help of public intellectuals, it can't be understated anymore. In 1950, when New China was just founded, it was in its weakest historical period, while the United States had just won World War II and was at the peak of its national strength. The gap in national strength between the two sides was the largest in history. The United States didn't hesitate to take action, but then was beaten down by China. In the Vietnam War, it had another indirect confrontation with China and was completely defeated. With such a great national strength and overwhelming advantage, the United States still couldn't win. Now in this situation, how can the United States fight? The U.S. military only knows how to fight in overwhelming situations and has never won in adverse situations. The Chinese military has been fighting in adverse situations since its inception, either fighting the United States with inferior equipment or fighting India with inferior troops. It has never fought in a situation with superior equipment and troops. Now the conditions are about to be ripe. What is wrapped in the traditional Chinese three-color woven bags in the Chinese military is already clear to the common people. I've spent my whole life in the military and am about to retire. I have to leave something for the descendants of the Chinese nation. This statement is greatly influenced by the military experience, especially for those senior generals. Young soldiers are eager to build achievements, while old generals are eager to be written into history books. The morale in the Chinese military is extremely high, while there is no such unified perception within the U.S. military. The equipment advantage is also gone. In this situation, it really can't fight. From a rational perspective, the policy of absolutely not going to war set by the Trump administration is correct, and the strategy of announcing it to the global media in advance is also correct. But when the US president here US room chief is presumably a wrong expression, and we assume it means US president says such things, it always makes me feel very strange. A normal country shouldn't speak like this. China has a long history, and basically everything can find its prototype in historical books. What the US president said this time can also be found in history, and that period of history is very close to us today. In the history of politics, to stabilize the country internally is to resist external aggression. Before the bandits are eliminated, those who advocate resistance will be severely punished. The original text here seems a bit chaotic and hard to understand clearly. This is a possible translation based on an assumption of the intended meaning. Now such an order seems to be signed by the new President of the United States. It's really like the change of dynasties. The trend of strength and weakness in the world has been completely reversed.